Hi there! Following up on my review of Dushevnaya's skill kit and recent changes, here's my third and final installment featuring the promised how to build guide, where I'll delve into her keys, fortifications, gear options and some gameplay tips to round things off. If you're unfamiliar with her skills or still unsure whether she's worth pulling, I suggest watching my previous review first, where I cover her general gameplay along with her strengths and weaknesses in detail. Without further ado, let's get started. Starting with her keys. Her first fixed key, Lance of Longinus, increases the crit rate of her S1 when she gains additional Isis Grace stacks, while already having the maximum of 4 stacks. Before the release of her mod key, generating Isis Grace requires defeating enemies affected by freeze debuffs. For this key to be worth the slot it occupies, you'd have to repeatedly max out your stacks and generate more before you can make use of your S1, a scenario that is mostly only feasible on maps with many enemies that Dushevnaya herself or Lodda can eliminate with AoEs. In general, I'd advise against using this key unless you have her V4 unlocked, which doubles the number of stacks generated, or once her mod key is released, making stacking Isis Grace much easier. For instance, when using a V4 Dushevnaya here, I finish off 2 debuffed enemies with Lodda, thereby maxing out her Isis Grace. The next kill from Macchiato causes an quote-unquote overflow of stacks, so instead 2 stacks of Lance of Longinus appear. Each stack increases the S1's crit rate by 5%, and when we aim the skill at an enemy, the preview already shows a crit rate with the 10% bonus from the 2 stacks. That said, I'm never big on effects that increase a skill's crit rate, since the effective DPS increase is usually minor. For example, assuming you're at a 65 to 70% crit rate, you'd only be increasing the damage of about every third S1 that would have otherwise missed a crit. Next is her second key, Adventurer's Will, which increases her freeze and stability damage when she hits a single target. This effect applies to both her skills and synergizes well with her sub-DPS role. On the right, you can see the increased stability damage from targeting only one enemy with her S2. Next, here's a side-by-side damage comparison when aiming her AoE such that only one target is hit. The effective damage increase is only around 10%, likely due to diminishing returns from the multiple sources of extra ice damage in Dushevnaya's kit. The key's activation is guaranteed when using her S1, whereas her S2 will mostly benefit from it in boss fights. So if you intend to squeeze a little extra damage out of the Chuni sniper, I recommend equipping this key. Moving on to her third key, Magical Support. I spent some time explaining its effect in my skill review of Dushevnaya, but now that I've had a chance to test it myself, it's worth going over the nuances. The gist is this: when Dushevnaya casts frost tiles in an area where frost tiles already exist, they quote-unquote react, by cleansing a buff from targets standing on those tiles and removing the tiles where a reaction occurred. In addition, she gains 1 stack of Isis Grace for each reaction, up to 3 stacks total. In this example, we start at 0 stacks of Isis Grace and cast her S2 on enemies not standing on frost tiles. After generating frost tiles underneath them, we cast her S2 a second time to trigger the tile reaction via her fixed key. Before the skill animation even begins, we receive 3 stacks of Isis Grace. Once the damage is applied, the 2 targets in the back die and the frost tiles remain, whereas the tile under the surviving enemy is cleansed due to the reaction. Keep in mind that while this is another source of generating Isis Grace, it also potentially removes the ice weakness from your targets. To avoid this, you can chain her double S2 with Suomi's ultimate going first. An important nuance is the difference between the hitbox of a boss and the tile it is standing on. As shown here, the boss has a 3x3 tile hitbox, of which 5 tiles are currently frost tiles, but not the one in the center. Using her S2 in this scenario, no tile reaction occurred and no grace stacks were gained. Starting over. With the frost tile in the center, we now receive a grace stack and the center tile is cleansed. Interestingly, though, the boss's implanted freeze weakness remains. This means that even though the tile reaction only occurs for the center tile of a boss, the effects of the other frost tiles within the hitbox still apply normally. Since her fully stacked S1 deals 20% extra damage when the enemy is standing on a frost tile, let's verify whether this applies to any tile in the hitbox or, like her fixed key, only to the center tile. On the left, the boss has an empty center tile due to the reaction, versus fully covered frost tiles on the right. As demonstrated, the damage is nearly identical, suggesting that you only need to worry about the boss center tile when trying to make use of her fixed key magical support. Continuing with her fourth key, Courageous Claymore. Strangely enough, this is her only utility key. It applies a 30% defense reduction to the targets of her S2 if she causes a stability break with the skill. For general use, the activation condition is easy enough to manage so long as the enemies have reasonable stability shields. However, in boss fights its application is trickier because the timing must be just right so that Dushevnaya is the one to break the stability. This can be somewhat inconvenient as you'll have to carefully monitor for the boss's stability to ensure you don't break it too early or inadvertently with support actions or interceptions. Here, you can see me slowly wearing down the boss's 28 stability with the team, while trying to have Macchiato go after Dushevnaya so she can nuke once the defense threat is applied. This tactic may not always work out, but when you can't bring Cheongju, this key is definitely worth equipping for a fight. Her 5th key, Heart of the Sage, grants immunity to movement debuffs while she has her ultimate buff, Glacial Domain. I can't see much practical use for this effect, nor do I understand why you'd bring a key solely to prevent movement debuffs. Finally, her 6th key, Holy Light, cleanses 2 debuffs from herself when she's standing on a frost tile. This may have some utility in boss fights where you really want to get rid of certain debuffs, so it's mostly something to remember to swap in for a particular fight that demands it. In summary, for most purposes you should be running her 2nd, 3rd and 4th keys. This setup provides defense shred utility on her S2, extra ice and stability damage against single targets, and an additional way to generate Isis Grey stacks with the bonus of buff dispelling. On a side note, her common key, Artistic Inspiration, is one of the best DPS keys in the game. It grants 10% bonus elemental damage against targets slower than the user, which means it applies to almost all bosses. Therefore, you can safely equip it on your favorite single target DPS to enjoy essentially unconditional extra damage. Moving on to her Fortifications. Her V1 increases the range of her ultimate from 7 to 9 tiles, and boosts the damage increase from Arctic Benediction from 10 to 20%. Additionally, every ally in range now gains a 2-tile movement increase and 1 random powerful buff for 2 turns. I've addressed the randomness of these buffs in previous videos, so I won't belabor that point further here. As you can see, the pool of possible buffs includes both offensive and defensive options. This is unfortunate because Dushevnaya's ultimate is supposed to increase your DPS. For example, on the left you see Loda receiving a buff that reduces her AoE damage taken, hardly the reason you'd invest in an additional copy of Dushevnaya. Notably, the randomness is fixed once the match starts. Here, I performed her ultimate 3 times using the rewind function, and every time the selection of buffs was identical. The only way to reset the random selection is to restart the battle. While you could do this on turn 1, on subsequent uses you're stuck with whatever the RNG gods have bestowed upon you. Overall, due to the long 3-turn downtime of Arctic Benediction and the unreliability of the random buffs, her V1 doesn't add enough to total team output to justify the extra investment. Next, her V2 makes her ignore 15% of cover damage reduction, which leans into her sub-DPS role. However, this effect is generally lackluster, especially since most bosses don't take cover. As a reminder, when your S1 is fully stacked, she already ignores 15% of cover, so together you can completely bypass cover damage reduction with her first skill. As shown here, on the left, the target still benefits from 10% cover damage reduction when using a normal attack, whereas on the right the fully stacked S1 indicates that cover damage reduction no longer applies. Since the damage reduction from the stability index is still in effect, this upgrade doesn't change much on its own. Moreover, with this upgrade she also starts to generate frost tiles in a 1-tile cross at her position. For now, the only benefit is an additional point of stability damage while standing on such tiles. Its relevance increases with her V6, which we'll address in a moment. However, on its own, her V2 adds nothing substantial. Her V3 increases the range of her second skill by 1 tile in all directions and boosts its damage multiplier by 20%. Although a 1-tile range increase might not sound like much, in practice, this new area of effect is quite massive. Setting frost tiles around the map will be easier than ever before. The extra damage is appreciated, though the lack of additional stability damage is disappointing, as that would have synergized nicely with her 4th fixed key. Overall, her V3 is a useful upgrade but nothing too game changing. Next, her V4 doubles her Isis Grey stack generation and increases the damage multiplier of her fully stacked S1 by 30%. As demonstrated here, it now takes only 2 defeated enemies to max out her stacks, allowing her to spam her S1 and justify her role as a sub-DPS. Nevertheless, the challenge of stacking Greys during boss fights remains unchanged, since requiring enemy kills is never ideal in those scenarios. This upgrade will only be noticeable on challenge maps with multiple enemies, which greatly diminishes its value. Once her mod key arrives, the additional stacks might even be overkill, but the 30% extra damage is still welcome. Her V5 increases the stacks of Arctic Benediction from 1 to 2 when using her ultimate. In other words, the team-wide 20% bonus damage now applies to everyone's next 2 attacks. reducing the ultimate's downtime from 3 turns to only 2 turns. I wish this effect had been part of her earlier fortifications, perhaps integrated with her V1, as that would have increased Dushevnaya's value as an amplifier at a more reasonable investment level. Unfortunately, coming in at V5, this change feels a bit late and serves mostly as a nice bonus when aiming for V6. In addition to the upgraded team buff, Dushevnaya's sub-DPS capabilities also benefit. She will now ignore 30% of a target's defense while Glacial Domain is active, and she can perform up to 3 action supports per turn. Currently, her assists are quite underwhelming, but that will improve with the release of her modkey. Finally, her ultimate now also dispels one buff from up to 4 enemies within its range. As shown here, nearby opponents have a dispellable shield that reflects 30% of the received damage back to our team. Using Dushevnaya's 9-tile ultimate range, 4 enemies are randomly chosen to have 1 buff cleansed. Note that even if there are fewer enemies, each will have at most 1 buff dispelled. Since Dushevnaya already has access to buff cleansing via her 3rd fix key, this added effect is more of a quality of life upgrade. To wrap things up, her V6 is the biggest value upgrade for her role as an amplifier. Passive damage bonus increases from 10 to 20% and her ice damage bonus changes from 10 to 40%. Just by existing, she now boosts the ice team's damage by a whopping 60%. It's as if the developers thought her kit was undertuned and only paying customers deserve better. Here I'm comparing the damage difference using Macchiato's S1 with only Dushevnaya on the field. As shown, the effective difference in total damage is about 27% for this attack. Next, when comparing with the Arctic Benediction buff, which further adds the 10% damage boost with her V1, the effective damage increase still remains about 27%. Note that this scenario excludes any impact from the random powerful buff. From this, it appears that Dushevnaya's damage boosts reach a saturation point, leading to considerably diminishing returns. Having to go all the way to V6 to unlock these bonuses is bad enough, and this means you'll also get a little less than you've literally bargained for. In addition to the passive amplification boost, Dushevnaya now gains the ability to inflict a 20% damage taken increase on her targets when she stands on frost tiles. Remember how her V2 added frost tiles beneath her in a small cross shape? That is now its main use. As shown here, the debuff is applied after Dushevnaya attacks, meaning that as our hybrid DPS she does not benefit from it on her own attack. Note that any attack, even her basic ones, will add the vulnerability. This can be quite impactful when she applies a debuff in a wide AoE with her S2. Taken together, her V6 is a pretty big deal, even in spite of diminishing returns. If you're saving your F2P pools for the occasional power creep character, Dushevnaya might not be the one for you. However, if you're willing to splurge a little on the game and want to push your ice team to the next level, she is a solid choice. Just keep in mind that it's an all or nothing investment. If you can't reach V6, you're probably better off leaving her at V0. Moving on to her gear options. Her signature weapon, Eulogistic Verse, has an average base attack with some bonus attack percentage. Its weapon effect, Winner Takes All, grants a 10% damage bonus when the user has insight, which is the case when her HP is above 80%. The secondary effect applies to the whole team, buffing everyone's damage by 5%, up to 10% at max calibration, when targets are affected by freeze debuffs. This bonus is doubled when targets are affected by Frigid specifically. In boss fights you're mostly looking at that 5% extra team damage, which isn't much. The weapon trait also allows her to ignore up to 20% of a target's defense. Overall, this weapon is primarily designed for a role as a sub-DPS, making it fairly interchangeable with other damaging options. Speaking of alternatives, her best F2P option is the Samusek. It boasts a higher base attack than her signature weapon and a generous 25% crit damage bonus. Dushevnaya's damage may not be too impressive at the moment, but with her modkey things should look better. The weapon effect adds an unconditional 10% damage bonus to her attacks, putting it on almost equal footing with the effect of her signature weapon. If you have it, the Battle Pass weapon Arcana is also a great option. Its base attributes are fairly similar to Eulogistic Verse, with only slightly lower base attack. The weapon effect grants a 15% damage bonus against targets more than 4 tiles away, a distance that is easily achieved given Dushevnaya's considerable attack range. Finally, her SR weapon, KSVK, has a decent effect that increases her damage against targets on frost tiles by 10% up to 20% with calibrations. Although this bonus requires some setup before you benefit from it, it's certainly manageable. This weapon shares the same trait as her signature weapon, allowing her to ignore up to 20% of a target's defense. Since SR weapons tend to have worse stats, this is the least preferable choice. However, if no other options are available, it will suffice. For her attachments, you face the usual dilemma with a mixed DPS kit, choosing between Phase Strike and Freeze Boost. Currently, Dushevnaya deals ice damage with her S2 and fully stacked S1, and physical damage with her unstacked S1 and support actions. Since stacking Isis Grace is quite challenging in boss fights, you may find yourself having to use her as one while it still deals physical damage. Thus, in boss fights specifically, your damage may be a little more split between ice and physical. Given that her physical attacks are underwhelming, opting for the Phase Strike set only min-maxes very small amounts of DPS. Instead, I suggest farming the Freeze Boost set for her since her mod key will eventually convert all her damage to ice type. By choosing the correct set now, you won't have to farm new equipment later. As an added bonus, you'll be farming the same set that Macchiato uses, meaning any god roll piece you acquire can be used on Macchiato instead. To wrap things up, I recorded a bit of gameplay using the ice team in the freshly unlocked Gunsmoke Frontline. Truth be told, I don't think Dushevnaya is a particularly complex character, aside from a few minor points to keep in mind. First, start the battle with her ultimate before your damage dealers attack. This not only buffs everyone, but also activates her support actions, which are tied to the Glacial Domain buff. It also refills her Confectance Index and enables you to execute a double S2 on the following turn. Note that the Arctic Benediction buff only applies to active attacks, so Macchiato retains the damage boost until she uses one of her 2 attack skills. Obviously, you want the damage increase to apply to her as one. Next, remember that you only gain Isis Grace when enemies die while affected by a freeze debuff, or when triggering tile reactions with her fixed key magical support. For boss battles, you're really stuck with the ladder method, which can be painfully slow. Here, the boss's stability is close to breaking, so we'll reduce it a little further using Suomi's S1 before we send in Dushevnaya. The boss is currently affected by the Edifice buff, which you need to cleanse in order to gain a stack of Siege that buffs everyone's damage. Since Dushevnaya has her 3rd and 4th fixed key equipped, we're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. We cleanse Edifice thanks to the tile reaction, and on the second use of her S2 we also break the stability and apply the extra 30% defense shred. Finally, keep in mind that Glacial Domain, her self buff from the ultimate, which also provides support actions, lasts 2 turns after activation. On the 3rd turn, you can still squeeze in 2 support actions before Dushevnaya acts and the buff expires. On the 4th turn, reapply her ultimate at the start to regain her assists, ensuring her support actions only suffer a single turn of downtime. Here, the boss has Edifice up again, which means we want to cleanse before the stacks are used up by our attacks. Since Dushevnaya doesn't have full Confectance points, we'd rather not use her. Instead, we have Tululu with her fixed key equipped, which cleanses 2 buffs before the attack. That way, we get our cleanse and benefit from Dushevnaya's assist on the 3rd turn. Now comes the saddest part about her current boss battle performance, having to use her unstacked S1 to fill the gap in her rotation. As for the remainder of the battle, her rotation repeats itself from here on out. Spam her S2 when you can to create frost tiles and cleanse buffs. If possible, try to break the stability for the defense shred. Get your assists in before you finish your 3rd turn after ult use, and best avoid using her S1 while it's not fully stacked, though sometimes you won't have a choice. And with that, we've come to the end of this guide. I hope you've enjoyed this 3rd installment of How to Dushevnaya and now feel fully prepared to unleash the best version of the Ice team, the only version for a long time. Here's to hoping that her mod key reaches the global server a little earlier, as that will significantly enhance her gameplay and her impact on the team's overall performance. In any case, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.